Joining us from Tucson, Arizona is Brother Guy Consolmagno. Brother Guy is the director of the Vatican Observatory and the author of the new book, A Jesuit's Guide to the Stars, exploring wonder, beauty, and science. Welcome back to Jesuitical, Brother Guy.
It's great to be here again.
Again, this is your third time on the show, which is the Three Timers Club is elite company. So congratulations on your induction into that. And thrilled to be chatting with you today because this book, you know, your way of talking about being a Jesuit and an astronomer, introducing a wider audience to the skies, which is great because we just found out that the skies are sending an asteroid directly at us. I learned this week. Could take an entire city, it seems like. Take out an entire city.
How worried should we be?
Yeah.
It's one of those marvelous things of mathematics. There is this huge realm of, think of a giant target, and the Earth is right at the center. Yeah. And there's an enormous target, and we know it's going to hit somewhere in that target. As we improve the orbit, the target gets smaller. So the odds of it hitting the Earth appear to get worse, better and better or worse and worse, depending on your point of view. Because it basically, the number in the denominator is getting smaller, so the number whole is, until suddenly we'll find out that the target no longer includes the Earth. And it'll go from really, 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 really dangerous, nothing.
Okay.
So that's one of those weird things of numbers you have to be prepared for.
So be prepared for it to get worse and worse, and then all of a sudden much better.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Well, and
if only much of life were like that.
Well, speaking of life, I think our first question we want to go with you.
Yeah. You have an interesting vocation story to joining the Jesuits. You were one of a later in life vocation. And those seem like they're getting more common. People will have an entire career and then realize something is missing, or there's something more that they want from life. So can you take us back to your young years? You go to Boston College, a Jesuit university, but you don't stay there.
Well, Boston College and I were a terrible fit. I'd grown up as a Sputnik kid, and of course, little boys are all going to be scientists. But when I went to the University of Detroit High School, the Jesuit high school in Detroit, I found out all the smart kids did Latin and Greek, and I want to be a smart kid, so I'm going to do Latin and Greek. Which meant by the time I graduated, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I wanted people to think I was smart, which is different from actually being smart, but certainly typical if you're 17 years old.
Or 32 in my case.
I went to Boston College because it was in Boston, which is where my dad was from, and I thought it was a great place. And it was Jesuit, because I had this idea that I wanted to be a Jesuit, maybe. Or maybe I was going to be a journalist, or maybe I was going to be a lawyer, or maybe I was going to write science fiction stories. I had all of these things that I wanted to do. I chose history as a major because I figured history covered everything. But I was living in the freshman dorms back in the days when, the local liquor store would deliver booze to the freshman dorms. And all the other kids are kind of interested in partying, shall we say. And I wasn't. Not only was I not interested, I thought they were a bunch of idiots who I couldn't stand being around. It was incredibly So in order to get out of the freshman dorms and to get away from these idiots, I decided I'm going to become a Jesuit. And I found a Jesuit priest who then looked at me and said, "Well, son, have you prayed about this?"
Because actually we do a lot of that same partying over here on this side.
Yeah, really. I certainly, hadn't thought about praying. Heck, I was 18 years old. So while I was waiting for the voice from heaven saying, "Yes, we'll take you we'll get you out of the freshman dorms," instead, what happened was a little question like, what's the job you think you're going to be doing if you become a priest? Like dealing with people with problems, just like the guys in the freshman dorms. This would be the worst job in the world for me. I'm totally incapable of handling that because I'm a nerd. My best friend, a guy named Mike Timrick, was going to MIT. We'd known each other in high school. And I'd visit him every weekend and felt this is where I belonged. They had the world's biggest science fiction collection, among other things. But I was a history major. I just on a lark decided to apply to go to MIT. And in the interview, they said, "Why do you want to come?" And I couldn't tell them about the freshman dorms and, reading science fiction. So I said, oh, I did journalism. I was in the high school newspaper. I want to be a science journalist. And that was the flavor of the week that week. When it came time to choosing a major, I by accident chose Earth and planetary science, not knowing that that was the department that was most desperate for students. They let me in. I am so astonished they let me in that I still have the admission letter in a frame on my wall. Looking at it, remembering that, miracles do happen.
Mm.
I found out that I loved being a scientist. And I went through the regular route, doctorate at Arizona, postdoctoral fellowships back in the Boston area, Harvard and MIT. And then at age 30, I'm thinking, really, why am I doing this when people are starving in the world? What's the point of astronomy? It's who cares about the moons of Jupiter? And I didn't have an answer, so I quit and joined the Peace Corps. And the first thing they did when I got to the University of Nairobi, they sent me to the university, of course, to teach astronomy to graduate students.
So you're looking to get this like direct service experience, feeding the hungry,
Yeah.
and then you're back kind of doing what you were doing.
What I was doing, I'd go out on the weekend to visit my other Peace Corps volunteers, and I'd take the little telescope along because I'm a nerd. Of course, I'm going to bring a telescope. And everybody in the villages wants to look through the telescope and see Jupiter and the moons of Jupiter. And they're going, oh, wow. And that's when it finally hit me why we do astronomy. Years later, when I became a Jesuit, I did enough education to remember the 7 days of creation, the Genesis story, that, is not very good science, but then that wasn't supposed to be science. It's a story about God. And it's a story about what God intends in creation. And the seventh day, the goal of creation, is the day when you can kick back and look at the sky and go, oh, wow. And that's what we were made for. And that's why you study the moons of Jupiter. I love teaching, by the way. I love teaching at the University of Nairobi. I was able to get a teaching job at Lafayette College, and I thought this was a wonderful little school in Pennsylvania. Small college teaching, that's it. That's what I'm going to do. Well, by this time, I'm nearly 40, and the various, romances had all fizzled out, thank you, God. But I was trying to figure out what to do with my life instead. And I remembered God telling me very strongly I did not have the vocation to be a priest. But Jesuits have brothers. Go, ooh, I could do that. I joined thinking that I was going to be teaching at a place like Loyola in Maryland or Georgetown. But with my degree, after my 2 years as a novice, 2 more years in philosophy, they ordered me, without asking, they ordered me under that vow of obedience to go live in the Pope's summer palace, eat that terrible food, do whatever scientific research I wanted to do, and if I can, talk about it in cool things like this podcast.
I got to go to Castel Gandolfo for the first time this past fall. It is I don't feel that badly for you, but I do want to I do want to back up real quick because that priest brother distinction I don't think is that I don't think most people are that familiar with that. Could you say a little bit like why not a priest, and then why does obviously the brother route make sense?
It's not easy to say. I remember when I was doing my philosophy, and there were a bunch of us, in early formation stages for Jesuits, we had a faith-sharing group to talk about, well, you want to be a brother or a priest? And we could go through all of the guys who were in our program and say, he could be a priest or a brother. No, he could only be a priest. And we could all identify, but trying to put into words exactly what it was. One way that I've heard it is that brothers are Jesuits first and priests second. Well, that's also true of some priests who are Jesuits. But there are other Jesuit priests who are clearly priest first and Jesuit second. Another way is a brother is somebody who's got a particular skill or a particular ability that the order needs and can use to support the order, whether it's being able to drive the bus or cook the meals or do astrophysics. They're actually not all that different because If you're good at it, it's as easy as falling off a log. And if you're not good at it, it seems impossible.
You mentioned liking teaching science, and I have to say, growing up, I never really had a great science teacher that like gave me those moments that you in your book you call them like oh my god moments where things just click and make sense. So I'm wondering, how do you do that? Like, how do you inspire other people, or what were some of the moments in your life where you had the oh my god moment?
Half of it is you wind up teaching yourself. You can have all the great teachers or all the terrible teachers, but through high school, there was not much science or math that I was taught that I didn't already know. Part of it is having the encouragement of family and friends, so that if you're a nerd, it's all right. Nerd is a thing, and we can deal with that. So that you have sort of role models you can follow. I think one of the great role models for kids nowadays is, Iron Man as portrayed in the Marvel movies, because he's shown as somebody who really enjoys what he's doing and isn't afraid of failing. That first movie where he goes through all the different failures trying to get something that works. That's the heart of what it means to be a good nerd. Part of it, though, is simply being willing to show your enthusiasm. There comes a time in teenagehood where it's not cool to show you're enthusiastic. And that's a shame, because there are so many cool things that you should be enthusiastic about. And a lot of being a grown-up is getting to live out the dreams you had as a kid.
I wonder if you could tell this little anecdote you have in the book about teaching at Fordham, where you're explaining, I believe, I am not a very good science nerd, so
Maxwell's equations.
Yes, yes. And a student sort of having a light bulb go off, and Ashley's calling this like an oh my god moment. I'm curious.
Well, that's where I got the phrase from, because that's what he said.
You say that like science depends on these. I'm curious what you mean by that.
Here's the dirty secret: most of science is boring. You do the same experiment over
There's a lot
and
of people
over
that
again.
are not going to find out that that's a secret, by the way. But
you do the same experiment over again, collecting one data point a day until you have several hundred data points. And oh my gosh, that's a year's worth of work. There's a lot of tedium involved in trying to make a computer program work correctly. There's a lot of tedium in any kind of thing you do in life. But if you've had enough of the fun, the payoff, whether it's the tedium of practicing so you're a better football player or a better ballet dancer or a better singer, that tedium is worth it if you have a little flavor of where it's going to come from. And that little flavor are those oh my God moments when suddenly you see something that you had never seen before and never even expected to see before. I tell the story in the book about teaching Maxwell's equations. There's a T-shirt I got from my MIT days that had the 4 equations with all sorts of weird letters in Greek. And above it says, and God said, Maxwell's equations, and there was light.
Mm.
So if you're a nerd and you've learned the equations, then you know why that actually is a funny thing to say. Because the equations are about electricity, and they're about magnetism, and they're about things that you don't think have anything to do with light. So when I did a sabbatical year at Fordham, because I really missed the teaching, and I asked them, can I teach the second semester physics class? Because this is where I had experienced my oh my God moment. And I'm writing these equations on the board, and I start playing with them, and you take the derivative of this and you move the pieces over there and you combine them, and it's at the end you wind up with the change of the electric field over time is equal to the change of the electric field over space, with a little constant thrown in there. And think of a wave. A wave is going up and down. If you're standing in the ocean, the wave goes up and then slows up. It's not going up so much, and so it slows down, and then suddenly it's going down faster and faster, and then it slows down. So the speed at which it goes up and down is changing. Or imagine you have frozen the ocean and you're walking through it. And then the bottom of the wave and the top of the wave does exactly the same thing. Because that's the equation for a wave. I was about to then turn to the class and say, and, say you're in an ocean, and before I even got that far, kid in the front row looks at the equation and goes, oh my God, it's a wave. And then I suddenly realized that must have been what Maxwell himself thought the first time he saw it. Because not only is it a wave, that little constant there that tells you the speed of the wave turns out to be the speed of light. What moves like a wave and goes at the speed of light? Maybe it's a light wave. And everything you can think of in modern electronics depends on those equations. The computers you use, the way that power is transmitted from Niagara Falls to New York City, everything we know about chemistry and how we can understand the way that chemical elements combine. These equations eventually led us to quantum theory and relativity. This was the beginning of science, and it all became possible because a guy named Maxwell was playing around with some equations and said, what if, and how about if I do this, and how about if I, and just, take the derivative and apply it. That you don't know where it's going. You never know where it's going. It's only fun when you don't know where it's going.
I was trying to, I didn't need to try to. It kind of just hit me to analogize this to the spiritual life, where you are in prayer and or you're rummaging through your day, or you're like paying attention to something, and all of a sudden, like, you see something, a certain light that reveals some, like, this dynamic of yours or a loved one's, or that just like clicks into the way, like, you understand how God works. I like, parents talk about this a lot, where they'll have this experience with their child, and all of a sudden, like, trying to teach them something or discipline them, and all of a sudden it clicks, like, oh my God, like, if this is how God must see the world. And that, like, moment of discovery feels like it's hardwired into us by a creator, almost, to give us this thrill to go after it again and again and again.
That is exactly why doing science is an act of prayer. Because that burst of joy is the presence of God. I'm reminded of we were talking earlier about Bob Dylan and the wonderful Martin Scorsese 4-hour documentary. At the end of it, one of the guys, he's now old and fat, wearing a loud shirt, but remembering the days when he was in the studio with Bob Dylan, and he said, Dylan did this, and that wasn't Dylan, that was the Holy Spirit. It is. And we laugh because it's so true.
Well, there's a lot of scientific prayer that I feel completely unequipped to do. But at the heart of your book is looking at stars, which is something I can do, everyone can do, all humans have done since the beginning of humanity.
Not as easily in New York City.
No, yeah, it has gotten harder. But so what came first, like people looking at stars and that leading them to thinking about the creator, or the other way around? Was it theology and then astronomy, or astronomy and then theology?
In me, it was both. But I think in the human race, looking at the sky is a natural thing to do. And most people don't know what the sky looks like, in part because of light pollution. Pope Benedict had a marvelous line in one of his homilies for Easter Saturday night, where he says, we create our own human lights that blind us to God's lights. And isn't that an image of what sin is? But when you do get to see a good dark sky, it's both beautiful and awe-inspiring. There is a reason why you attribute the heavens and heaven, because they both draw you outside of yourself to something that's bigger than yourself. At the same time, when you start thinking about the universe and the stars and start asking, okay, what is that? Then you're doing science. But on the other hand, if you're looking at it and you're saying, how can I express the way that beauty makes me feel? Then you're doing poetry. And if you look at it and say, how could I capture that? You cannot make dots of white on a black piece of canvas as small and as pure as stars. So you have to do other things to evoke that feeling, which is, Van Gogh. All of those are ways of engaging with the sky and ultimately engaging with God.
You talking like that reminds me of this part of your book where you talk about the advantages and disadvantages that Jesuits in particular have when it comes to doing science. And one of the advantages, I think, is you get this well-rounded liberal arts education, and you in particular, kind of bounced around a little bit before kind of doing science full time. What are some of the other advantages and disadvantages to being a Jesuit scientist? Because we seem to see them throughout history all the time.
The biggest advantage is it gives you the reason for why you're doing it. I went to MIT to read science fiction and to hang out with my friends. That's not going to be enough to sustain you for the rest of your life. You've got to find more than that. A lot of people don't. Some people wind up in science. It's the only thing they know how to do, and they find it terribly boring, which is really a shame because they've lost the reason why they did it. A Jesuit never forgets why we're doing it. It's for the glory of God. It's not for the glory of Guy. And I'm not doing this, to get my name in the paper or to have books with my picture on the cover. It's kind of embarrassing that I've got a book with a picture on my cover. So that's, I think, the biggest thing is it reminds you why you're doing it. But in addition, it gives you something to do with it. Because as Jesuits, whether it's in schools or books, we always feel that we have to share it with somebody. And that's true of science. What they try to teach you in the lab course is if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. So that's an essential part. There are a lot of practical things too. When I was being funded by NASA grants, I was always at the mercy of what NASA decided they wanted to fund this year. And I'd better have results after 3 years or the grant's not going to get renewed. When I came to the Vatican and I was part of the Vatican Observatory, the boss then, George Coyne, said to me, here's your job, do good science. Doesn't matter how long it takes, doesn't matter what kind of science it is, as long as it's good. The work that I've done in meteorites has been survey work that has taken 10 years to amass enough data that it's interesting to people. I could never have done that if I was being paid in a university. I would have not gotten tenure. I would have not gotten my grant renewed.
There's a practical element to that, but I also suspect there's an imaginative one too, where religious projects tend to take place over longer periods of time, and even to the point where you don't see maybe even the beginning or the end of a project. If you think of a cathedral being built, right, that would be worked on for hundreds of years. You could be a person laying the stones. You might do it in the middle, never see it completed. And I feel like a lot of science requires that almost long-term, almost selfless perspective where you're just kind of putting another brick into the cathedral of knowledge, and you're not really sure where it's going to go. And if you
or another brick into the wall if you're a Pink Floyd fan, there's two ways of looking at that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the other advantage of being a Jesuit is you've got a moral sense to figure out what kind of wall is it that I'm building.
Yeah.
Is it a cathedral or is it a prison?
Well, the Department of Government Efficiency has clearly not gotten to the Vatican yet. Then, if they're just telling you to do good science and that's it.
You mentioned how, it's hard to look at the night sky and not, have the sense of awe. But one thing you acknowledge is that it can be like awful or awesome. Like it can be a very scary experience and overwhelming to think about how small we are in the universe. Or it could be an amazing thing where it's like, this universe is so large and yet there's a creator that cares about us. So I'm curious if you could talk about like personally what you experience when you look at the night sky and how that shapes your idea of God.
I'm reminded there was a dentist here in town who's a lot of astronomers in Tucson because it's a big world center of astronomy. And so he put pictures of galaxies and things like that on the wall in his waiting room thinking that this might, be a nice distraction for people waiting to get their teeth drilled. And he found out it was just the opposite, that half the people in there were terrified at looking at how big the universe is. On the other hand, we put together calendars with these images, and a lot of these go to men in prison. It's a big part of prison ministry and working with Jesuits who do prison ministry. And one of them described to me how one of the fellows looking at it goes, "It's that big? God must really be big." Which is, well, yeah. When I go outside and I look at the sky, the first thing is it's pretty. The next thing is I can recognize those stars as old friends that I learned out of the book written by H.A. Rey, the guy who wrote Curious George. And he wrote this marvelous How to Learn the Constellations book. It's been in print since longer than I've been alive, and it's still a great book. So I've got this, I'm familiar. When I was in Africa and feeling homesick in the Peace Corps, those stars made me feel at home. There's also the memory of my father teaching me these stars, pointing them out to me. So there's a personal history. And then beyond that, there's a layer of the scientific history. I can say, oh yeah, there's Orion and there's Betelgeuse. And I remember 5 years ago when suddenly Betelgeuse got visibly dimmer and we were all wondering what was going on. Or there's the part of the moon that I had to map when I was in graduate school. And I remember the time and the people and the places and what it all felt like. So there are all of these different layers. And every one of them is rich and important to me.
I want to ask you about this episode involving Pius XII that you recall in your book, where he comes pretty close to endorsing the Big Bang Theory, because he's like, look, this basically works with Genesis. So since it's let's just put a stamp of approval on it. And that the the pioneer of the Big Bang Theory, Father George Lemaitre, he convinces the Pope to not do that. Why is that?
It's a real temptation. It's called concordism. It's such a temptation, it's got its own name. And you take something you have learned in science, and then you find, oh, if I read Genesis just the right way, it was there all along. There are many things wrong with this. The first and most fundamental is it misreads what Scripture is trying to tell you. I'm reminded in a funny way of all the arguments. What was the Star of Bethlehem? And the Star of Bethlehem was supposed to point you to the baby. And if you're more interested in the star than in the baby, then you've missed the message. What was the message of Genesis? Not that it was this kind of science or that kind of science, but that it was, whatever the science is, it was God. There's a deeper fallacy there, though, and that's the belief that science is the last word, the ultimate truth. If science were the last word and the ultimate truth, there'd be nothing left to do. It would be the most boring thing going, because it would be where I don't have the surprise for an aha moment or an oh my God moment. And so trying to map today's science onto Scripture as if this was validating Scripture, number one, gives you a lousy reason to believe in Scripture, because number two, today's science is going to be obsolete tomorrow. And you're going to find out, oh, everything we did in that exercise, we have to go back and do again because it's a little bit different. The trouble is, I think people are always looking for certainty. Whether it's, I'm only going to do the experiment where I know the answer so I can be reassured that I'm still seeing the truth. Or I'm only going to be doing these prayers because these prayers will make sure that God will listen, because it's built in. If I do these things 5 different ways, it's superstition. And it's scientific superstition as well as religious superstition.
To go back to Father Lemaitre, is this out of humility on his part, or is he looking at this like, you don't want to go down this road because something could happen and my theory could be bupkis, and then you're going to be caught with your pants down?
Very much the latter. And not only that something could happen, something will happen. If we're doing our job right in 50 years or 500 years or 1,000 years, we'll find out that the answers that the Big Bang Theory was trying to address aren't even the right questions. And that's the way that we learn. And that's why it never runs out of having wonderful things to give you brand new, oh my God, moments.
I'm curious why you think, I think I know why there were so many Jesuit or clergy who were scientists in the past. You know, they had the institutional resources and the education to do that. Why do you think so many scientists today are not religious?
Here's a deep secret. They are religious. When I became a Jesuit, I'm basically about 40 years old. I've been in the field 20 years. I've got lots of friends who are scientists. I'm thinking, what are they going to think? And by far, the most common reaction was, I didn't know you go to church, because I guess my life didn't show it. Who knows? And then they'd say, let me tell you about the church I go to. And I'm going, I didn't know you were a churchgoer either. I remember once there was a dinner. I'd gone to a talk at MIT, and there was a dinner of about 6 different faculty members and their spouses, all sitting around talking. I'm there from the Vatican, so religion comes up. And every one of them describes the church they go to on Sunday and how they don't like the organist. I mean, there are universal things that unite all of us, right? But I don't think any of them realized that the others were religious. It's the kind of thing that you don't give yourself permission to talk about because you think and even the scientists who don't participate in a religion, very few of them would call themselves atheists. They would say they're agnostic. They would say they don't know. One of Carl Sagan's grad students once told me that he had the wonderful line, an atheist is somebody who knows more than I do.
I remember you gave a talk when I was in college at Loyola Chicago, and someone asked some version of that very question, and you said, all the scientists believe in God. Go to the English department if you want to find atheists. They don't believe in truth.
That's it. Especially if you're doing, what's that kind of criticism they do nowadays? It's
Postmodern theory or
postmodern
theory.
Right.
Yeah.
And sadly, the other people who are more likely to be atheists are journalists. And I think they've just got a certain built-in cynicism. And hey, as I say, I started out as a journalist, so I can kind of see where that comes from.
I want to ask, let's see if I can phrase this correctly. The church has kind of relied on certain paradigms of scientific understanding, or whether maybe it's like heliocentrism, or and that sort of builds like a foundation for how we do philosophy or theology. And occasionally we've had to change those paradigms in order to do better theology and philosophy. I'm curious, and that happens, so I'm sort of truncating maybe like 100, 200 years worth of fighting over that very thing. I'm curious where you see today the biggest fights over what our scientific status quo is as it pertains to theology.
The biggest fight now that's different from the past is that the theologians had been burned so often that they're afraid to tread there anymore. The theologians are often afraid to learn the science and to see how the science actually works. They're afraid of the science. And that's a shame, because all of the things you talk about are the attempts to find the right poetry to try to describe things that can only be described with poetry, whether it's the physical universe or the nature of God. And, the joy of Aristotelian physics is that it gave a whole language to Aquinas to be able to say, hey, here's a way that we can get a handle on what God's like. Now, if it happens that Aristotelian physics doesn't have all the tools we need, you can use these other analogies. But when you fall into the trap of that concordism and saying, God is really like, God is like the way that a simile or a metaphor is like. God isn't that thing. But then science isn't that thing. The equation that Newton came up with for gravity gives answers that are like the path of an actual falling object. But it's not actually gravity. It's just a poetic description of a particular aspect of what gravity does.
So Are you saying I don't want to fall into the sin of concordism? So there's nothing in science that, I don't know, points to the existence of God, or it's just not definitive proof of God. How would
It's
you
the other way
describe it?
around.
Okay.
It's the other way around. It's what is in religion that points to the existence of science. You could not do science without certain axioms, assumptions, religious beliefs. You have to believe that the universe is real. There are Zen versions that don't believe that. You have to believe that there are not nature gods to give you room to look for, all right, then why does lightning strike? You have to believe that the universe is so good that it's worth spending your life studying it. And there is an answer to why should I study the moons of Jupiter when people are starving? Because it turns out we don't live by bread alone. In other words, God isn't the thing you come to at the end of your scientific work. It's the assumption you start with that allows you to do the science.
That makes sense. I guess I was wondering, like, the idea that there are these laws in nature and that we are conscious beings that can try to figure them out and exploit them. That's, I think some people would point to that as like a sign that there is a creator God that we can be in relationship with.
It is certainly wonderfully consistent with the hypothesis that there is a God. And that's very reassuring. But if you had decided that you're going to believe that everything is random and there are no reasons for anything, or if you wanted to believe that there are nature gods that cause everything to happen, and they're just fooling you into thinking that you're happy, they're just fooling you into thinking you have free will. It's like I cannot prove that the universe is 14 billion years old, because the universe might have been invented 2 seconds ago with me with all my memories of a past that are just totally false, and we're all living in the Matrix. I don't think that's the case, and I don't see any reason to live my life as if that were the case. But my assumption is, no, there is a reality, and there is a God who made this reality.
Brother Guy, I want to thank you for spending so much time with us today and unpacking some of these big capital S and lowercase s scientific questions. But before we let you go, we have one question that you've already answered twice on this podcast, and that is, if you could canonize one person, living or dead, Catholic or not, fictional or real, scientist or not, who would it be and why? And for context, listeners, in the past he has canonized Bob Dylan and Frodo Baggins. So your third answer.
I knew this was coming, and I did not prepare this. But the one that leaped into my brain was my old advisor at MIT, John Lewis, who's well into his 80s, doesn't see very well anymore, was fascinated by transcendental meditation and health foods and raising goats, and became a devout Mormon. He's a seeker. But the real moment that taught me about how to be a scientist and a human being, he had a marvelous theoretical understanding of the chemistry of the earth. And someone showed up one day in the lab with a piece of data that looked like it would unravel everything that he had come up with. And his reaction was to be so excited because we'll find out what's true, rather than being horrified that all my work will turn into nothing. That is a sign of sainthood.
Agreed with that. So, all right, St. John.
Okay, again, the book is A Jesuit's Guide to the Stars, Exploring Wonder, Beauty, and Science. Thank you so much for joining us, Brother Guy.
It's been a delight to be with you guys again.